What if I told you that one of history's greatest heroes suffered a death so brutal even his enemies were shaken? This isn't a legend. This is the real story of William Wallace, a common man who dared to challenge a king and fought for freedom until his last breath. What happened to him wasn't just execution. It was a horrifying message to the world. And today, we're going to tell you the truth, a truth far more terrifying than anything Hollywood ever showed. Double asterisk. The hero England feared the most, imagine this. A man walks through the misty highlands of Scotland. He's not a king. He doesn't wear armor of gold. He holds no title, no crown, and yet his name alone would one day make kings tremble. That man was William Wallace, a legend, a warrior, and a symbol of freedom. In the late 1200s, Scotland was drowning under English rule. King Edward I, known as Longshanks, ruled with an iron fist. He believed Scotland was his to take, its land, its people, its pride. He sent armies north, burned villages, executed leaders, and crushed anyone who dared speak of rebellion. But amidst that silence, one man stood up. He wasn't born into power. He didn't inherit an army. He was just a common man, a farmer's son. But when the English killed Wallace's family, they created their worst nightmare. William Wallace turned pain into purpose. He gathered farmers, blacksmiths, hunters, everyday people who had nothing left to lose, and gave them something worth fighting for: freedom. With unmatched courage and tactical brilliance, Wallace led his people to one of the most shocking victories in British history, the Battle of Stirling Bridge, 1297. There, with a much smaller army, Wallace outsmarted and destroyed an elite English force. The message was clear: Scotland would not kneel. To the Scottish people, Wallace became a hero, but to the English crown, he was a dangerous rebel, a threat that had to be erased, not just defeated, but destroyed. King Edward was furious. He wanted revenge, not just to kill Wallace, but to make an example of him, to show the world what happens when someone dares to rise against a king. He ordered a manhunt across Britain. "Bring me Wallace," he said, "and I will show Scotland what real fear looks like." But William Wallace was not so easy to catch. He became a ghost, moving through forests and mountains, inspiring more Scots to rise. He was not just a man anymore, he was a movement, and that made him even more dangerous. But even the strongest movements can be betrayed, and the one thing Wallace never expected was the knife that would come from someone wearing the same tartan as him. The betrayal that changed everything. He was too fast for them to catch, too smart for their traps, too inspiring to be ignored. So in the end, they didn't defeat William Wallace with swords. They defeated him with betrayal. After years of leading rebellions, surviving ambushes, and slipping through the fingers of the most powerful empire in the world, Wallace had become more than a man. He was a symbol. To King Edward I of England, this was the worst kind of enemy, one who could not be killed by battle alone. Wallace had embarrassed the English crown with stunning victories. His name echoed through Scotland like a war cry, giving the people hope. And hope, to a tyrant, is dangerous. So King Edward changed the strategy. He couldn't beat Wallace on the battlefield, so he bought a man who would betray him off it. In August 1305, near the city of Glasgow, William Wallace was captured, but he wasn't caught in battle. There was no heroic standoff, no sword in his hand. He was betrayed by one of his own countrymen. Sir John de Menteith, a Scottish knight, sold Wallace out to the English in exchange for wealth and political favour. To this day, his name is remembered in Scotland with shame and anger. Wallace was dragged from the shadows in chains. His wrists were bound, his ankles shackled. He was thrown into a wooden cart like a trophy. The man who once led armies, now paraded through streets by the very people he fought against. From town to town, he was hauled like a criminal, But even in chains, he never lowered his head. Some people spat at him, others cried at the sight of him, and many stood silently, broken-hearted. They weren't just watching a man fall, they were watching their nation's last hope being taken away. It took weeks to bring Wallace from Scotland to London. The journey wasn't just physical, it was psychological torture. The English made sure he passed through busy cities and villages so crowds could mock him, but Wallace remained silent, strong, unshaken. To the English, this was justice. To the Scots, it was heartbreak. When he reached London, the message was clear. We didn't just capture your leader, we crushed your spirit. But the truth was far from that, because Wallace didn't scream, he didn't beg, he didn't break. Even when he was thrown into the dark, cold cells of the Tower of London, he remained defiant. To him, this wasn't defeat. This was sacrifice, a price he was willing to pay for the freedom of others. But the real cruelty was yet to come, because King Edward had something planned, something far worse than death. He didn't just want to silence Wallace, he wanted to erase him. He wanted the Scottish people to see their hero fall, not like a soldier, but like a criminal, humiliated and tortured in public. What was coming was not a trial, it was a show, and what they did to William Wallace would go down in history as one of the most horrifying executions ever carried out in Britain. But even in the darkest moments of his capture, Wallace gave them nothing, no fear, no regret, only silence and pride, because sometimes silence is louder than any scream. The fake trial, the real sentence. By the time William Wallace reached London, the verdict was already decided. He would not receive a fair trial, because this was never about guilt or innocence. This was about sending a message to every Scot who dreamed of freedom, to every rebel who dared to stand against the crown. King Edward wanted to show them what would happen if they followed Wallace's path. Wallace was dragged before a court in Westminster Hall, one of England's most powerful and public venues. The same hall where kings were crowned would now be used to crush a man who dared challenge one. He was brought in chains, weak from weeks of travel, his body bruised, tired and worn. But when Wallace stood in that courtroom, he stood tall. Eyewitnesses said he showed no fear, no shame, only defiance. He faced a room filled with enemies, men who had already decided his fate. They listed charges: treason against the English crown, murder leading armed rebellion, refusing to recognize King Edward's authority. Then came the moment they expected him to beg for mercy, to admit his crimes. But Wallace, even with nothing left, spoke the words that would echo through history. I never committed treason, because I never swore loyalty to Edward. The courtroom fell silent. It was a powerful truth. He wasn't an English subject. He was a free Scot, fighting to defend his people from foreign rule. But the truth didn't matter here. This was not a court of law. It was a stage, and Wallace was the actor meant to die in the final scene. The judges, English nobles loyal to Edward, pronounced the sentence. He was to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. It was not just a death sentence. It was a ritual of pain, designed to humiliate, terrify, and make an example of the victim. A slow, public, and unspeakably cruel process meant to strip away not just life, but dignity. To many in the crowd, this punishment was horrifying, but to the crown, it was a celebration, a victory over a man who had embarrassed them. Still, even after the verdict, Wallace did not break. No begging, no tears, just silence and strength. To him, this trial was not about his own life. It was about something bigger, his people. He knew that this fake trial, this political theater, would not erase what he stood for. He had already become a symbol, and no punishment, no cruelty, no public execution could take that away. In fact, what the English didn't realize was this: by turning Wallace's final days into a spectacle, they were not erasing his legend, they were cementing it in history. Soon the streets of London would fill with people, not to witness justice, but to watch a man be destroyed in body, but never in spirit. And what Wallace endured next was so brutal, so horrifying, that even centuries later it remains one of the most infamous executions in European history. But in that moment, in that courtroom, he gave the world one final reminder. That real power doesn't come from crowns or armies. It comes from standing for what is right, even when you know it will cost you everything. The most horrifying execution in British history. It was no longer about punishing a man. It was about crushing a symbol. William Wallace, the man who once led a nation toward freedom, was now being led through the streets of London, not as a prisoner, but as a warning, a message carved into flesh. On the morning of August 23rd, 1305, a large crowd gathered at Smithfield Market, one of the busiest places in London. Children sat on shoulders, merchants paused their trade, nobles arrived in carriages, and guards kept the road clear. They weren't there to witness justice, they were there to watch pain. Wallace was stripped of his dignity, his clothes torn, his body bound. He was tied to a wooden frame, dragged through the mud by a horse, from the Tower of London to Smithfield. This was not simply to move him, it was a public display meant to humiliate, to show that no man, not even a hero, could stand against the English crown. But Wallace, even in those final hours, he never screamed, never begged. His silence was louder than the shouts of the crowd. Now came the execution, but this was not a single blow or a swift ending. This was the infamous punishment King Edward had chosen personally. Hanged, drawn, and quartered, a method so brutal its name alone terrified generations. But we won't describe it in detail here, because Wallace's story is not about the violence done to him. It's about what he endured without breaking. As the executioners did their work, many in the crowd looked away. Some wept. Even hardened soldiers were said to turn pale. And yet Wallace, bound, bleeding, dying, still had more courage than all of them combined. Legend says that even as his body failed, he looked toward the heavens and whispered one final word: freedom. Whether it's fact or myth, no one truly knows. But those who watched never forgot. When it was over, the English believed they had destroyed him. They displayed parts of his body across Scotland, in Newcastle, Berwick, Perth, and Stirling, to frighten the people into submission. But it didn't work. Instead of silence, there was rage. Instead of fear, there was resolve. The execution that was meant to erase him had turned him into a martyr. William Wallace's death was horrifying, not just in pain, but in the coldness with which it was delivered. It was not meant to kill a man, it was meant to kill an idea. But the idea lived on. In fact, it grew stronger. Within years, a new leader would rise, Robert the Bruce, who would finally lead Scotland to victory and independence at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. Wallace's dream didn't die that day. It was planted, and it bloomed through the sacrifice he made. Even today, 700 years later, people visit his monuments. They speak his name. They remember his courage. Because what William Wallace faced was beyond pain, beyond fear. It was the ultimate test of what one man would endure for the sake of his people. And he passed that test, not by fighting back, but by refusing to break. The legend lives on. They thought they had silenced him, that the chains, the torture, the execution would be enough to bury not just the man, but the movement. But William Wallace's death didn't end the fight for freedom. In fact, it became the reason it truly began. For many Scots, Wallace's brutal execution at the hands of the English wasn't just an act of cruelty. It was a call to arms, a wake-up call to the soul of a nation. Because when a man gives up everything, comfort, safety, even his life, for his people, that sacrifice plants a seed, and seeds, when watered with pain and memory, grow into revolutions. Just 9 years after Wallace's death, Scotland rose again, this time under the leadership of Robert the Bruce, a man who had once hesitated but now felt the fire Wallace left behind. In 1314, at the Battle of Bannockburn, Scottish forces faced the mighty English army, and won. It was a turning point in the war for independence. Many believe that without Wallace's sacrifice, that moment would never have come. His courage had lit a path others were finally brave enough to follow. But Wallace's legacy didn't stop at the borders of Scotland. His story spread far and wide, across Europe and eventually the world. Generations of freedom fighters from different lands and different centuries would look to Wallace as proof of what one voice can do against tyranny, because Wallace proved something powerful. A sword can kill a man, but courage, that can shape a nation. Centuries later, in the 1990s, Wallace's story reached millions through the Oscar-winning film Braveheart. While not historically perfect, the movie reminded the world of the man who stood against a king, a man who believed that freedom was worth everything, even a painful death. It gave new life to the phrase shouted through centuries. They may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom. Today, statues of William Wallace stand tall in Scotland. Schools bear his name. Tourists visit the Wallace Monument in Stirling to honor his memory. And every year, Scots and admirers from around the world remember the man who gave his all, not for power, but for principle, not for revenge, but for freedom. Wallace didn't live to see an independent Scotland, but because of him, it was made possible. He didn't die with glory on a battlefield. He died in pain, humiliated, yet undefeated in spirit, and that's why his legend lives on. William Wallace may have died over 700 years ago, but his story still lives on. He wasn't just a warrior, he was a symbol, a voice that rose when everyone else stayed silent. He stood for freedom. He gave everything, even his life, for his people. And that's why, even today, we remember him. If his story moved you, inspired you, or opened your eyes, please like, share, and subscribe. Because in a world full of silence, the voice of courage must always be heard. ****.